He thought she was asking him to end it. The woman was collapsed in the dust, her clothing ripped, her whole frame trembling, fingers pressed into the cracked earth like it was the only thing keeping her from dissolving entirely. Caleb Hurst stepped off his horse without rushing, boots settling into dry soil, gaze locked on her the way a man looks when he's turning something heavy over in his mind. She didn't raise her head. Maybe she already knew what came next for women like her. The sun was sinking over the wide flats of the valley. The kind of heat that didn't leave when the light did, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made thinking hard. Caleb closed the distance slowly, one careful step at a time, his shadow stretching over her like a warning. When he got close enough, she flinched. Not a small twitch. A full-body brace, the kind built from repetition. Her shoulders pulled inward, her lungs stalled, and she turned her face sideways like she was already bracing for the impact. Then the words came. If that's what you're here for, then go ahead. Flat, hollow. Not a plea, not a fight. Just a voice that had already been emptied out. For a moment, it almost sounded like surrender. Like she'd mistaken him for one more man sent to drag her back into something she hadn't chosen. Caleb didn't respond right away. He'd heard that particular tone before. It never came from someone performing. He lowered himself slowly, studying her the way a man does when he's comparing what he sees against what he's been told about people. Her wrists were marked, fresh. Her knees were shredded, not from one bad fall, but from a pattern of them. And somewhere to the east, faint but growing, came the low drumbeat of hooves. She never looked up long enough to see his face. As far as she knew, he was just another rider who'd arrived too late to matter and right on time to collect her. She heard the horses, too. Every muscle in her body locked up again, the way something caged does when it hears the door. Caleb made his decision without deliberating. He didn't ask her name. Didn't ask who was behind her or how deep the trouble ran. He simply gathered her up firm and careful and set her in the saddle. Then he mounted behind her, turned the horse away from town, and pushed out into open country. The riders behind them were closing. Ahead of them was nothing but silence, and a choice that was about to rattle an entire valley, because she believed she had just crossed paths with another man who saw her as something to use. But what if she had it completely wrong? What kind of man hears those words and decides not to take them? Caleb rode until the sound of pursuit thinned out into wind. He didn't look back. Men riding hard like that didn't quit easily, but they also didn't chase blind into open territory without knowing what was waiting for them. When the sun had dropped another hour, he cut off the main trail and angled toward his property, nestled near a low ridge where the ground stayed slightly greener. The woman hadn't spoken since they left. She sat rigid in front of him, body still running even though the horse had slowed to a walk. When they came into the yard, a woman named Ruth stepped out from the side door, drying her hands on her apron. She'd managed Caleb's household longer than most things in this country lasted, and she could read trouble from 50 yards off. She looked the woman over once. Didn't say a word of question. Bring her inside, she said. Simple as that. The interior was dim and cooler. Plain walls. A table worn to softness. The thick, stale smell of coffee left sitting too long on the stove. Ruth helped the woman into a chair, placed water in front of her. She drank like someone who wasn't sure the cup would stay if she hesitated. Caleb kept his distance near the doorway. Not hovering. Not leaving. Just present. After a while, the woman spoke. Sarah, she said, like she was checking whether the name still fit. Caleb gave one slow nod. That was enough for the moment. The story came out gradually. Not all at once, not in any kind of order, just fragments dropped quietly, the way a person talks when they've learned the hard way that words can be turned against them. She'd been married less than a year. The Aldridge family held land near the only reliable water source for miles, which meant in that part of the country, they held almost everything else too. One family, one name that had to carry forward. That was what Catherine Aldridge cared about, more than decency, more than honesty, more than the young woman sitting across Caleb's table. Sarah had blamed herself at first. That's what they'd told her to do. But she found out the truth the way people usually find out things no one intends for them to know. Her husband couldn't have children. He had known this before the wedding. Had always known. And had said nothing while she walked into that house believing otherwise. Caleb shifted his weight. He'd seen men deceive before, but this variety of deception, the kind that locked someone else inside a lie they didn't know they were living, sat differently. Sarah continued. Catherine wouldn't accept the reality of it. Said the land couldn't transfer without an heir. Said the family name wasn't going to fade out while she was still drawing breath. And so the household began to change around Sarah. Doors closing when she entered rooms. Voices dropping below hearing range. Thomas, her father-in-law, finding reasons to be near her when her husband wasn't around. Not in the way a father-in-law should be. No need to elaborate on that. Some things communicate themselves without having to be spelled out completely. Her husband didn't put a stop to it. That was the moment she understood she had no one in that house. That detail seemed to carve deeper than anything else. He told me to give it time, she said. Give it time. While something had already been decided for her inside those walls, as if patience could fix what rot had already set in. The night before she ran, Catherine locked her in the back bedroom and told her morning would bring resolution. Sarah didn't wait for morning. She forced her way out, tore her hands open on the frame, and kept moving on foot until her legs gave out in the open flats, right where Caleb had found her. Silence followed. Even the small sounds of the house felt larger in it. Caleb looked at her, not as a stranger, not as a complication, but as a person standing right at the edge of something that could finish her off permanently. Then he asked the only question that carried any weight anymore. Do they know which direction you went? Sarah shook her head, but her expression said something different. They would figure it out. And when they came, they wouldn't be coming alone or quietly. So the real question wasn't whether trouble was headed his way. It was what Caleb Hurst intended to do when it arrived at his fence line. Would he hold his ground or step aside the way everyone else already had? Morning arrived heavy and still, the valley holding everything in. Caleb didn't wait around. He was saddled before the heat climbed, rifle checked, one look thrown back at the house where Sarah was resting. Ruth stood in the doorway. She won't move, Ruth said. Caleb gave a short nod. He rode into town by himself. Harlan's Crossing looked normal enough from the outside. A few horses at the rails, men gathered low in conversation outside the dry goods, wagons grinding through the center rut. But there was something pulled tight in the air. Word had already moved. Not the truth. Something shaped to travel faster. He stopped at the general store first. Bought nothing. Listened carefully. One man said the Aldridge place had a domestic situation. Another said the young wife had run off with property that didn't belong to her. That was how it always started. Not with facts, with a version built to protect the people telling it. At the livery, the man working the shoes didn't look up from what he was doing. That said plenty. Outside the saloon, he heard it said plainly. Aldridge girl bolted. Not Sarah, not a person with history and wounds. Just a problem that had left without permission. Caleb settled against the hitching post. Then a voice came from just behind his left shoulder. You've got the look of a man asking into things he'd be better off leaving alone. Deputy Hank Pruitt. Hat pulled low, hand resting near his holster, not gripping, just settled there as a reminder. Caleb didn't turn immediately. That depends on what the things are, he said. Hank moved up beside him. Aldridge is saying she took cash and ran, he said. Man with good sense stays clear of that. Caleb turned and faced him, still unhurried. Man with good sense doesn't rattle easy, he said. Hank's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then he reached for Caleb's saddlebag. That was his error. Caleb caught his wrist and held it. One of the Aldridge hired hands stepped in from the right. Another came from behind. Things moved quickly after that. Dust lifting. Someone going hard into the water trough. A sharp word from somewhere in the watching crowd. Caleb didn't fight frantically. He fought the way a man fights when he's been through it enough times that the anger has been replaced by precision. Brief, solid, finished. Hank ended up pressed against a post. Breath knocked clean out, dignity in worse shape than his body. Caleb leaned in close. Next time, he said quietly, make certain you know which side you're standing on before you get in my path. Then he released him and stepped back. The street had gone quiet the way streets do when people are watching, but don't want to be noticed watching. Caleb remounted and turned toward the road out of town. He'd learned enough. The Aldridge family wasn't chasing down a missing woman because they were concerned for her. They were chasing a story they couldn't afford to have told out loud, and that meant they were already on their way. If you've been with me this far, you already know this one goes somewhere real. So stay close. Maybe get yourself something warm to drink and tell me where you're listening from. Because what Caleb does next is the moment this stops being one woman's private ordeal and starts becoming a public reckoning. By the time Caleb cleared town, his mind had already settled the matter. He didn't push the horse. Didn't look behind him. Hurrying was how men made the kind of mistakes they couldn't walk back. When he reached the ranch, Sarah was sitting on the front step with a cup in her hands, both trembling faintly. She looked up at the sound of hooves. For a half-second, the old fear crossed her face. Then she recognized him. That recognition, the relief in it, said more than anything she could have put into words. "They're already building their story," Caleb said. She stepped down from the porch. "That doesn't surprise me." He tied the horse and walked a few paces closer. "They're telling people you ran off with something that wasn't yours," he said. Sarah gave a short, exhausted nod. "Of course they are." Wind moved through the grass. Somewhere nearby, a hinge complained against its frame. Then Caleb said the thing that changed the temperature of everything. "I'm taking you back into town." Sarah went still. Not from fear this time. Something closer to disbelief. "Taking me back?" she repeated. He didn't soften it. "Yes." Her grip on the cup tightened until her knuckles whitened. "So they can have me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "So they have to hear you." That hit differently than anything she'd expected. She studied him, trying to understand what kind of man walked deliberately toward this sort of trouble. Caleb didn't explain himself further. "I don't tuck people away," he said. "And I don't hand them over either." That was the whole of it. Plain and without decoration. The following morning, they rode into Harlan's Crossing together. Not by the back way. Not quietly. Straight down the middle of the main road, visible to everyone. That alone was enough to pull the town to a standstill. Men like Caleb Hurst didn't walk trouble through the center of town unless the point was to be seen making it. People paused their errands. Heads appeared in doorways. Women turned away from shop windows to look. Even Hank Pruitt, still moving stiffly from the day before, pushed himself upright near the jailhouse. And then the Aldridge family appeared, Catherine out front, her face a closed door, Thomas coming behind her, and William, her son, Sarah's husband, the color of old ash. Sarah felt her ribs tighten. This was the moment. Everything either got spoken or got buried for good. Caleb stepped down and helped Sarah to the ground, not as though she needed assistance, just as a steady point of contact. Then he walked forward into the middle of that street. No raised voice. No theater. Just words that carried as far as they needed to. "She's with me," he said. That was not what anyone had prepared for. That one sentence struck the crowd differently than a fight would have. Because in a town like Harlan's Crossing, a man saying those words openly was the same as drawing a boundary in front of witnesses. The street held its breath. Catherine stepped forward first, her voice like a blade. "That woman belongs with her husband," she said. Caleb answered without shifting his tone. "Then her husband can tell me that himself." Every face turned to William. He stood without speaking for a long moment. Catherine started to talk over him. Thomas moved closer with a quiet, hardened word. Catherine pushed more words into the air, faster, louder, as though enough volume might keep the truth from finding any space to settle. William looked at both of them, and then something inside him finally gave. He said it plainly. Right there on that street in front of whoever was listening. He said that Sarah was never the problem. He said it without pride or force, just with the weight of something that had needed saying for a long time. And he said it knowing there was no path back from it. That one admission pulled the entire constructed story apart. Thomas tried to intervene, tried to reshape the moment, but it was already gone. People had heard sufficient. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Some of the older ranchers who had known the Aldridge name for decades turned their eyes to the ground. They didn't intervene. Hank Pruitt didn't move. He had already read which direction the current was flowing. And just like that, the weight that the Aldridge name had always carried was lighter. No violence. No legal proceeding. Just truth spoken in a place where it couldn't be recalled. Sarah stood on that street without trembling. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't bracing for the next impact. For the first time, she looked like someone who had come through the worst of it rather than someone still inside it. And for the first time, she wasn't looking for anyone's permission to exist. Caleb didn't say much after. He didn't need anything further from that day. He had only ever needed to live as the man he'd already decided to be. He just stood where he was, like someone who had made his choice long before any of this played out publicly. And maybe that's what lingers with you. Not the confrontation. Not the woman. Not the words thrown in that street. But the moment a man quietly settles on what kind of person he is going to be and doesn't step back from it when it starts to cost him something. Because out there, in those years, there wasn't always a system that would stand up for you. Sometimes the only thing that stood between a person and something wrong was another person who chose not to walk past it. And honestly, I'm not sure that's changed as much as we want to believe it has. I'll tell you something true. I've sat with a lot of stories over the years. Most of them don't resolve cleanly. But every once in a while, there's one where someone shows up at exactly the right moment. Not because it's convenient, but because they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't. So let me ask you something. If you had been the one riding that road, would you have kept going and told yourself it wasn't your concern? Or would you have turned that horse around, knowing full well what kind of weight was attached to that decision? And if you had been Sarah, would you have found it in yourself to keep moving when everything in you wanted to stop? Sometimes the choices that matter most are the ones made in silence when no one is recording them. And those are the choices that determine everything that follows. For Sarah, that choice meant more than getting free. It meant she could finally stand in the open without waiting for the next thing to come for her. If this story meant something to you, leave a like and subscribe so more